Welcome back to our lecture for Chapter 3, Screening and Staging Engagements. Now we are going to cover Learning Objective 2, which is to define a conflict of interest in the context of a forensic accounting engagement, and also to explain the importance of identifying and disclosing any of these potential conflicts of interest. So any potential conflict of interest must be identified before you as a forensic accountant accept an engagement. So in this context, a conflict of interest may arise between the interest of two clients or the interest of the client and the forensic accountant. In these situations, the key consideration for a forensic accountant are to remain objective and independent. So objectivity and independence are critical. So let's define objectivity. That requires the forensic accountant to be neutral, unbiased, and they have to be intellectually honest. Independence forbids the forensic accountant from accepting any engagement that impairs his or her objectivity. So if a conflict of interest is identified, it must be fully disclosed to the client before you accept the engagement. So there has to be written consent that has to be obtained by which the affected parties explicitly acknowledge the conflict, and you waive any objections related to that conflict of interest. So it is important for a forensic accountant to identify any conflict of interest before you accept an engagement because of this alleged of a conflict, right? Whether it's real or perceived, that could serve to undermine you as an expert and your credibility as an expert. So regardless of the consent, it is recommended that all engagements in which there is a potential for a conflict of interest, that it has been identified, you should just not accept that engagement. You should reject it. So conflicts of interest can be identified when you review the subject complaint, or you review the case facts, or you review the respective attorneys as well. Now let's talk about learning objective number 3, which is describe the purpose and the context of an engagement letter. So an engagement letter is basically, it's proposed, right? And it will be accepted. And so then once the engagement letter is accepted, then that's considered a secured engagement letter. What an engagement letter does, it identifies the responsible parties, it defines the nature of the relationship, it identifies limitations on the scope of the work to be performed, and it outlines specific terms. It is generally addressed to the engaging attorney or to establish the expert's relationship as an attorney's agent. So to ensure a meeting of the minds, it is suggested that the engagement letter be signed by both parties. And an engagement letter can be amended or supplemented if both parties approve. And engagement letters are encouraged, they're not required, but the AICPA's professional standards usually recommend that you provide this litigation service and you have an engagement letter. The specific context of the engagement letter depends on the nature of the engagement, but you do have to address certain general or basic information, such as identification of the responsible parties, the purpose of the engagement, the nature of the relationship, any limitations on the scope of the work, any issues of independence, any conflicts of interest and confidentiality, ownership, use of materials, and the attorney work product. It also will outline fees, how invoicing is going to be handled, any retainers, a right to terminate, and it will also state a dispute resolution provision. So there has to be caution that you have to exercise when you're drafting these engagement letters, as they can be used as a valuable source of insight into the litigation strategy of the client. So in order to keep the information provided in the engagement letter to a minimum, you want to estimate the costs and you want to have a timeline of the engagement. That's kind of difficult to do at the onset of the engagement. So therefore, what you do is you just avoid any of these commitments in the engagement letter, and you might add that later. Now let's talk about the fourth learning objective, where you want to identify the factors involved in what we call framing a case and explain how each case impacts the case development. So once an engagement is accepted and an engagement letter is executed, we have the staging of the engagement, and that's what starts the engagement. So staging involves planning and coordination of an assignment in terms of like you're scheduling the work to be completed, you're compiling any of the necessary resources, Staging an engagement involves framing of the case where you adopt a scientific approach and the value of the research. So framing a case involves boxing it by specific control factors that are included. So you might have the type of case. So the type of case could be criminal or civil, and it determines the required standard of proof. So that will drive your evidence gathering process and the scope of the engagement. So the standard of proof also impacts the manner in which you as an expert opinion are going to express. Then we have jurisdiction. So a court's jurisdiction is the domain over which it exercises judicial authority. So different jurisdictions significantly impact how a case is developed and how the evidence is presented. So if you have federal cases, those are usually formal, and they have more formal federal courtrooms, have extensive technological resources. They facilitate more flexibility in the presentation of any visual evidence like photographs or videos or slides. And then different jurisdictions often have different laws and utilize different rules of procedures for evidence. So for example, domestic law varies from state to state, and it'll impact a business valuation engagement, for example, for the purpose of a divorce. So before you accept an engagement, practitioners like forensic accountants need to address the potential jurisdictional issues that can arise when you're engaging with counsel. Then we have professional standards. So as a forensic accountant, you must adhere to all applicable professional standards, whether it's the AICPA or the NACVA. And this will basically have general ethical standards, so any issues of integrity and objectivity or competence and due professional care. It could have developmental standards. This addresses your expert opinion. It could have reporting standards. This addresses the form and the context of your expert report. And experts must have a working knowledge of all of these professional standards, and you have to adhere to them. And in order to have your opinion and your case and your report have some validity. Last, we also want to talk about the nature of the engagement. So the nature of the engagement, it could be like a fraud investigation, you could have a business valuation, you can have an economic damages calculation, so that's the distinguishing characteristic of the case, and that drives the type of evidence that you need to gather and the way that your evidence is analyzed and your conclusions. And then we have the purpose of the engagement. So different engagements are for different purposes, right? Even engagements of the same type, for example, divorce or valuations, they could also have different purposes. You might have a fraud examination that can stem from an internal suspicion, or you can have a formal criminal charge. So the purpose of the engagement also drives the development of the case. And this concludes the end of our lecture.